To create a new React.js application, first let me open a terminal and then get into desktop where I have a folder called React.js examples. The command to create a new project is create React app followed by the name of the project you want to create. In my case, I want to give it as React.js demo-1. This will take a couple of minutes. All right, it took nearly 3 minutes in my case. So I'm going to clear the screen. And if you check now, the current directory has another folder called React.js demo-1. And I'll get into that directory by typing cd React.js demo-1. And I have to type npm start to start a dev server, which opens localhost 3000 on a browser. If you are seeing this page on your browser, that means your application is working properly. Let me switch to Visual Studio Code. And since I already had opened that React.js examples, which is on my desktop in this Visual Studio Code, I see my React.js demo-1 also over here. If you expand this, you'll see two important folders, public, src. Now the public contains one file here called index.html, which contains lots of comments. Let me get rid of the comments. They are self-explanatory for your reference. And if you see, there's only one single element called div whose ID is root, which is what actually we are going to be referencing to. So I'm going to save this file. So if you actually check the browser, this is nothing but the div that you are seeing over here. Just to verify, if I right click here and then go to inspect, I should see here that there is a div whose ID is root, and inside that there is a div whose class name is app, and then there is a header, there's an img, paragraph, and so on. So we want to know how this particular div class app is injected inside this div ID root. To check the same, let's go back to the Visual Studio Code, get rid of this index.html. There are a couple of other files like favicon.ico and manifest.json. If you come to the src folder, there are a couple of CSS, JavaScript, SVG are available. The only file that is important here is the index.js. So except that, I'm going to delete all other files by selecting one by one and then right click and say delete them. Now if you go back to the browser, you should see some errors. That's because somewhere it is referencing to app.js. If you go to index.js, you'll see that there is a reference to something called app.js is made here. Since we don't have this anymore, that's why we're getting an error. For the timing, I'm going to get rid of all this content, effectively deleting everything that the project created for me. I'm just going to put some console log just to check that this is working. So I'm going to say here, it's working. Save it. And if I come back here, there is no error. But if I go to view, developer tools, and look at the console, it says here it's working, which means the content of this index.js is now included in the index.html over here. So if you go to the elements here, you'll see that after the div/div whose ID is root, there are a bunch of scripts that are injected, and one of the script consists of my file over here. Of course, we don't want this. We want to see how React.js works. For this, let me get rid of this and type import React component from React. So there are two imports that I'm doing. This is not inside the bracket because this one is the default export from here, and this is a named export from the module called React here. As we have seen in the previous lesson, a React component is nothing but a simple class that inherits from a class called component. So let's create one. Class app extends component. As we discussed in the previous lesson, every React component must have a function called render, which returns the actual component's body. So this part is going to be a XML. So you can type a div /div, and inside that I can type here something like h1, I can type hello world, and then I can put a semicolon to say that this is the end of this return statement, though that is optional. Save this. We do have a component here, but it is not rendered onto our browser. We have to tell React.js that there is an element whose ID is root or any other element for that matter, and then find that element and render this component over there. So there is a object called React DOM, which has a function called render. We can use the same thing. For this, I'm going to import React DOM from React DOM. This is an object which has a function called render, and that takes two parameters. The first one happens to be the element that you want to render, which is a custom element we have created over here. This is called app, like this. The second parameter is where do we want to render the app, and that is document.getElement by ID of root. As soon as I save this and go back to the browser, you should see that the hello world is now injected inside this div whose ID is root. So effectively, a component is a simple class which has a function called render, and the render function is automatically called, and the return value, which is an actual XML content, will be now rendered onto the location that we want to render. Now, if you're coming from traditional JavaScript background, you might be wondering what kind of syntax is this? Technically speaking, even though I have given the file extension of .js, this is not a JavaScript file. This is actually a JSX file. So you can name that as JSX if you feel like, but at this point in time, we will name it as index.js itself. However, this syntax is an XML syntax. Since JavaScript has an XML inside that, it's called JSX or JavaScript XML syntax. Now notice that this particular member has never been used anywhere here, but if I remove this, it will give an error, because if you have any JSX like this or like this in your entire file, you have to have the React in that particular file imported. Of course, the component has been used over here. React DOM has been used over here. The XML part of the JSX can also make use of the variables and functions that are defined as part of this class. For example, if I have a variable here called const msg equals to hello world, like this, and if I want the output of this to be included over here instead of the actual XML consisting of that, I can remove this and then use a single curly bracket and type the expression which is the variable here, which means any variable or function calls if we have, we can make use of the same thing inside the XML part of that here. Save it, and if I go back to the browser, I still see the same thing. So just to make sure that whatever that we are getting the output is from here, let's also declare one more variable, const name equals to Vinod, and then I can say hello world from, and then I can say here name, which is this variable. So now we have multiple expressions used inside the same h1 here. So if I go back to the browser, you can see hello world from Vinod has been displayed over here. Generally what we code here is an HTML content, but we strictly follow the XML rule over here. For example, if you want a horizontal line or rule, we have to use the HR tag. In HTML, this would have been okay like this, but you can see we are getting an error because in XML, you cannot simply have an open tag. It has to be closed. You can close it in this fashion as well. Let's have some paragraph, and I'm going to type here powered by React.js. Save this, go back, and you'll see that we got this same as well here. As and when this particular HTML starts growing bigger and bigger and becomes more complex, we would like to divide this component into smaller components. For example, I can create a new file called appheader.js, and I can now type here import React component from React, and then I can say here export default class, and then I type here app header extends component. So what we're basically doing is we are creating a class here, and that is being exported from here, which we can import in this part and then reuse the same thing. So first let's complete this app header, which is going to have a render function which returns a JSX. So here I'm going to just copy the JSX from this section here, H1 and HR. I cut this from here and I'm going to paste it over here. Now since we are looking at an XML, and XML must have a single root element where we have two elements here, we have to surround this with some parent tag. Generally we can work with the div here, but in some cases we will not be able to use or wrap these elements with the div because they may actually affect the presentation. For example, if you're using an HTML table, this is supposed to be a bunch of TD/TDs. You cannot surround that with a div because TDs are surrounded by TR. In case if you don't want to use any HTML element over here, we can also import another built-in component called fragment from React, which is actually a dummy element. So I can use that as if it is a parent element like this, but in the HTML, this will not be included at all. And since these two variables don't exist over here, let's just type in a message, hello world from Vinod. Save this. Now we have a component called app header. It's there in a separate file, and in index.js, I would like to use it. To use the same, I will first have to import. I'll say import app header from /app header. And then I don't need these two variables. And then I can come here and then say app header /. Now if I go back to the browser, you can see we got the message from the app header, and this is coming from here itself. Similarly, I can also have a app footer. So I'm going to create a new file called appfooter.js. I will simply have a new component. But for this, I would be interested to use a different mechanism. Instead of creating a class that extends component, we want to use a regular function here. So I'm going to type here export default, and then I type here function. The name of the function is supposed to start with capital letters, so I'm going to use app footer as the name, and then I say here return a JSX. So here I'll type div/div paragraph. I'll say here ampersand copy 2019 all rights reserved by K Vinod Inc. Save this. Now the reason we are seeing that error here is because the moment you have a JSX expression, you must import React here. So I'll say here import React from React. Save it. The error is gone. So if I come back to the index.js, I can now say here import app footer from /app footer, and then I can say here app footer /. Notice the difference between the app header, which is a class that inherits from component, has a function called render, and that returns a XML fragment, whereas app footer is just a function that returns an XML fragment here. So if I go back to the index.js, everything is fine. There are no errors. And if I come down here, you can see that the output has come nicely. You can also add some styling to your application. And obviously this is a JavaScript XML combination. There is no place for styling over here. You have to create styles separately in some CSS file. It's a convention that whenever you have a component, you create a CSS in a component specific CSS file. For example, for app footer, I can create a file called appfooter.css like this. And then here I can define some classes. For example, I can say app-footer is a class. So I start with a dot. I can say here text align to center. Maybe I can say font style to say italic. And then probably font size to probably 80% of its original size by giving 0.8 em. Now I have this app footer, but that's not being used, so we don't see that style in effect over here. So now in order to apply this style, let's go to the app footer and we're going to go to this paragraph, and then we'll say here class equals to app-footer, Save this. If you go back to the browser, you will see that there is an error. It says invalid DOM property class. Did you mean class name? So that's mainly because class is a keyword in JavaScript. So you cannot use this class. You have to say class name. Save this. Now if you go back, you will see that there is no error, but still we don't see this effect. This is because the CSS corresponding to this we are not imported. Let's go and do that. Import /app_footer.css. Save this, and if you go back to the browser, you should now see that it is a little bit smaller in font size, it is center aligned, and it is italicized. Instead of this over here, I can have something like app content /app content. Let's do a top-down approach. So since we don't have this, let's try to import this file app content from a non-existing app content file. Obviously that's an error. Let's go and create a file called appcontent.js. So I'm going to go create here an appcontent.js. Inside that, I'm going to create a new component. And this time, I want to show you some shortcut snippets. First, I will type imrc and I press enter. And you can see that we got import React component from React. The second one I'm going to type here as CCS and press enter. And you can see it has automatically got the entire class definition for us. Class app content, extends component. There's something called state that came up. I don't need that right now. Then there is a render with a return. And here I can type a div, for example, /div. I'll type here maybe h3. This is the content area of our application. Now, of course, we have the class and it's being exported over here. In index.js, we already have imported it and we have used over here. So if I go back to the browser, you can see it says this is the content area of our application. Now, likewise, if you want a styling for this, let's first import a non-existing file like appcontent.css. We don't have this file, we need to create one. Copy this, and I create a new file called appcontent.css. Let's type here something called app-content, and let's give a min height of around 400 pixel. And we will use the same thing over here by giving this class name. So I can say here class name equals to app-content. Save this, go back to the browser, and you can see that there is a minimum of 400 pixel gap between this. We can also give some styling as far as the entire app itself is concerned. So we have here index.js. The index.js has a div. I can define a class name for this called, for example, app. And let's import from /index.css, which is not there. I'm going to create a new file called index.css, and then I'll type here .app, max width of maybe around 1100 pixel. I can also specify margin 0 auto to make sure that the entire 1100 pixel is going to be center aligned. I save the index.css and the index.js. And if I come back, you can see that there is a margin on the left side as well as on the right side.